Gandhi's Passion: The Life and Legacy of Mahatma Gandhi by Stanley Walbert. Let it be remembered that Western civilization is only 100 years old. He cautioned, "We pray that India may never be reduced to the same state as Europe. The Western nations are impatient to fall upon one another. When that flares up, we will witness a veritable hell let loose in Europe." 6 years before the outbreak of World War I, from distant South Africa, the budding Mahatma shuddered at the thought of such hell waiting to be let loose. By mid August of 1908, with some 60 Indians in Johannesburg jail, Gandhi wrote Smuts urging him to repeal the Asiatic Act at once or face the consequences of a mass satyagraha against it. 2 days later, he addressed a meeting of his community advising all assembled there to burn their identification certificates they currently held, explaining that he had not come out of the jail before my time was up to avoid any hardships. He would rather spend his whole life behind bars than see Indians subjected to indignity. Hundreds of certificates were burned that day, and a week later, at a larger meeting, 525 more individuals cheerfully burned their Asiatic identification cards. "I do declare that our fight, my fight," Gandhi thundered, "has always been for a principle. General Smuts has been saying that we claim partnership. We do. I claim it now, but I claim it as a younger brother. Their Christianity teaches them that every human being is a brother. The British Constitution teaches us. It taught me when yet a child that every British subject was to be treated on footing of equality in the eye of the law. But I do demand that equality." By thus taking his stand atop pillars of Christian brotherhood and British equality under the law, Gandhi reminded Smuts and the entire British establishment of their most cherished ideals, challenging his adversaries to live up to principles they themselves professed. The coming struggle, Gandhi anticipated, would be a bitter and extended one. Though 2,300 Indians burned their certificates by the end of August, Gandhi had hoped for at least twice that number. But some Indians were secretly applying for certificates in Johannesburg and elsewhere, while others were being sentenced to months at hard labor in the Transvaal. Gandhi himself was locked up in Foxrust jail in October of 1908. From his cell, he sent a message lauding passive resistance and passionately arguing that suffering is our only remedy. Victory is certain. Kasturba felt so dangerously ill 3 weeks after he was jailed that the government offered to release him to go to her bedside. But Gandhi refused, writing his wife a rare letter in Gujarati, which was read to her by their nephew. "I am very much grieved, but I am not in a position to go there to nurse you. I have offered my all to the Satyagraha struggle. If you keep courage and take the necessary nutrition, you will recover. If, however, my ill luck so has it that you pass away, there would be nothing wrong in your doing so. I love you so dearly that even if you are dead, you will be alive to me. I will not marry again." Kasturba survived and Gandhi was released from prison on December 12, 1908. The next day, he addressed Johannesburg's Islamic Society. "We have won because of the suffering of our people. A community, 1,500 members of which have been to jail, must certainly be considered victorious. The echoes of this campaign have already been heard in India and in the rest of the world." He left for Natal on Christmas Day and was at Kasturba's bedside on December 26th. 4 days later, Hari Lal was arrested and five more Indians joined him on New Year's Eve. Gokhale and Feroze Shah Mehta convinced Congress to pass a resolution denouncing the harsh and cruel treatment of British Indians in the Transvaal. Gandhi now wrote of the third phase of the Transvaal struggle, reminding the readers of the Indian opinion that to climb the last steps was always hardest. The main object of this fight is that we should learn to be men, to be a nation, to cease being the goats that we are and be lions, and to show the world that we are one people, children of India ready to lay down our lives for her. It marked a most significant change in Gandhi's goal. No longer did he urge Indians to prove how they could be proper Englishmen. Instead, he focused on rallying them to become brave, united Indian lions. To help build national pride, Gandhi now stressed the importance of using Indian languages only when Indians wrote or spoke among themselves. Any nation that cherishes its individuality must love its own language and feel proud of it. He wrote in Gujarati. The learning of English must come second to learning one's mother tongue. A few years later, when Gokhale visited South Africa at Gandhi's behest, Gandhi insisted he address the community only in Marathi, Gokhale's mother tongue. Gokhale tried in vain to persuade Gandhi to permit him to speak in English, the language he knew best, but finally gave up in frustration, muttering, "You will have your own way in this, as in everything." Virtually no South African Indians had come from Maharashtra. So Gandhi translated whatever Gokhale said into Gujarati, understood by every Indian merchant who attended en masse the meetings Gokhale addressed. Before the end of February 1909, Gandhi was sentenced again to 3 months in prison, going cheerfully, repeating Raw's admonition that in a tyrannical state, the only appropriate place for a free man was prison. He was arrested along with Henry Pollock and taken first to Foxrust, but transferred a week later to Pretoria Central Jail. On March 10th, he was brought to court in handcuffs, looking thin and unhealthy. The Reverend Doak protested the manacles and felt ashamed that a man of the character and position of Mr. Gandhi should be insulted in this way. Gandhi was released on May 24th and addressed a meeting that day at Pretoria's mosque. He who has tasted the sweetness of jail life will never shrink from it. I find no happiness outside jail. While in jail, I could devote myself regularly to prayers. Gandhi was now hailed in Johannesburg as the king of Hindus and Muslims. He insisted, however, that is not right. I am a servant of the community, not its king. I pray to God to grant me the strength to lay down my life in the very act of serving. He was so overwhelmed with emotion as he uttered those words that he could not continue for several moments, but then regained his voice. If any Indian talks of defeat, that will mean that he himself is defeated. If a person going to jail is firm in his resolve, he is ever victorious. The internal transformation of Gandhi that had begun more than 3 years earlier was now fully realized. The British barrister emerging from prison in iron cuffs had been reborn as the passionate leader of his community, not as their king, but in an even more exalted role in the eyes of millions of Hindus, who were soon to worship him as Mahatma. A satyagrahi gives no thought to his body. The transformed Gandhi explained, "Fear cannot touch him at all. That is why he does not arm himself with any material weapons. In his constant pursuit of the truth, a satyagrahi must be indifferent to wealth." Gandhi argued, though, This does not mean that a satyagrahi can have no wealth. Money is welcome if one can have it consistently with one's pursuit of the truth. A satyagrahi would be obliged, moreover, to break free of family attachments, walking alone on the edge of the truth's sharp sword, indifferent to any temptations, fear, or tyranny, single pointedly focused on his faith in God. If we learn the use of the weapon of satyagraha, we can employ it to overcome all hardships originating from injustice, not here alone, more so in our home country. The universal efficacy of Gandhi's spiritually inspired method of non-violent struggle against any form of injustice was thus, for the first time, clearly articulated by its remarkable author. He had not only transformed himself through the soul tempering fires of suffering and hardship, but had turned his particular grievance over the Black Act from a struggle launched on behalf of his tiny community in the Transvaal and Natal into a mighty message. It became a torch destined to light countless paths to freedom for millions suffering from discrimination and oppression, whether perpetrated by imperial or provincial tyrannies in every dark corner of the earth. Gandhi was appointed to lead another Indian deputation to London in mid June, and he reached Southampton on July 10, 1909. Tragically, shortly before Gandhi arrived, Lord Morley's political aide de camp, Lieutenant Colonel Sir William Curzon Wiley, was assassinated by a Punjabi student terrorist. Recalled as a singularly kind, genial, unselfish, and helpful creature, Curzon Wiley was known for his sympathy for all things Indian. From his Westminster Palace Hotel, Gandhi wrote to Henry Pollock of the terrible tragedy about Sir Curzon Wiley, which complicates the situation here. Lord Ampthill agreed to assist Gandhi, but only after being reassured that South Africa's Indians had neither any connection with nor sympathy for India's extremist party, to which the assassin belonged. Gandhi wrote again as exhaustively as possible on the history of his community's struggle and met with everyone willing to see him, answering all questions and granting interviews to all reporters. Gandhi sought a meeting with Colonial Secretary of State Lord Crewe, but to his disgust, he was not immediately welcomed. He no longer had the patience or optimism that had energized his first deputation to London. Those who occupy positions of power show little inclination to do justice. Their only concern is to hold on. I think it will be far better to submit to still further suffering than exhaust ourselves in such efforts and waste so much money. Suffering is bound to bring redress. He had lost most of his faith in the old liberal, moderate methods of political petitions sent up to viceroys, secretaries of states, and prime ministers by the Gokhales and Mehtas of Congress. Though he rejected Tilak's violent speech and all terrorist action, Gandhi, on the eve of his 40th year, preferred incarceration and passionate suffering to polite pleas in a language attuned to the eyes and ears of British barristers. He feared nothing but was weary of waiting for justice long overdue. His most important interview on this visit was with Lord Morley, then in his final year at the helm of the Indian office in Whitehall. Morley listened carefully and, as Gandhi reported soon after their meeting in late July, promised to help. Still, Gandhi urged his friends in South Africa to fill the jails, insisting that no force in the world can compare with soul force, that is to say, with Satyagraha. Smuts was in London at this same time, working out the details of South African integration into a union over which he would soon preside. Lord Ampthill did his best to bring Smuts round to accepting Gandhi's position, as did Sir Mukerjee, who also met with Gandhi. While in London, Gandhi attended a great suffragette rally at the end of July and met Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst. We have a great deal to learn from these ladies and their movement, he wrote Pollock, enclosing Mrs. Pankhurst's Votes for Women and other pamphlets sent on to Phoenix. In the next Gujarati article for Indian Opinion, Gandhi quoted Project Mrs. Pethick Lawrence, who said there could be no building for progress unless some men do the building with their blood. These words should be pondered by every lover of India. If we want freedom, we shall not gain it by killing or injuring others, but by dying or submitting ourselves to suffering. The Transvaal struggle is for the defense of our honor, for freedom. To lay down one's life to achieve this is as good as remaining alive. To go on living without it is no better than being dead. It was more than 3 decades before he would launch his great Satyagraha campaign, the Quit India movement in 1942, whose mantra "Karega ya marega" meant do or die. Yet for Gandhi, as early as mid 1909, the only honorable alternative to Indian freedom, whether in the Transvaal or in India, was death. To Gandhi's mind, London had lost most of its earlier appeal, as he wrote to son Manilal in August. The more I observe things here, the more I feel that there is no reason to believe that this place is particularly suited to any type of better education. I also see that some of the education imparted here is faulty. Not that he was against allowing his boys to visit London for a while, but he felt more certain of the value of educating them himself or through teachers living at his ashram. His ideas about marriage and sex also hardened. He felt strongly opposed to any early marriage and wrote, I believe very few Indians need marry at the present time. A person who marries in order to satisfy his carnal desire is lower than even the beast. For the married, it is considered proper to have sexual intercourse only for having progeny. The scriptures also say so. It is not clear which scriptures he had in mind, though they were probably Catholic and certainly not Hindu or Dharma Shastra or the more ancient Vedic Aryan texts. He went on to warn his son against procreation as well as marriage, arguing, all the progeny born now are mean and faithless and continue to be so. Do not think that I want to bind you not to marry even after the age of 25. Manilal was 18. I do not want to put undue pressure on you or on anyone. I just want to give you advice, though you are but a child. He continued to think both of Harilal and Manilal as children, despite their maturation, plagued as he was by feelings of guilt over his carnal lust that led to the birth of both older sons. Harilal had already married and fathered a daughter, for which Gandhi viewed him as mean and faithless. Even from the distance of London, he attempted to save Manilal from similar fall. Regrettably, despite his saintly goodness and brilliance, Gandhi never managed to probe the dark roots of his irrational Puritanism, which haunted and obsessed him until the end of his life. That isn't his relations with at least one of his loving sons is certain. He never congratulated any relatives on the birth of a child. To his nephew, Kanlal's wife, Kashi, who had just given birth to a daughter, Gandhi wrote from London. What shall I write? If I say that is good, it would be a lie. If I express sorrow, it would be violence. I would only say and wish that you learn to control your senses. Gandhi's growing disillusionment with London and Western civilization reached its peak soon after Louis Beroit completed the first flight from France over the English Channel and American Dr. Frederick Cook claimed he had reached the North Pole, a claim refuted by Admiral Peary. While the world applauded, Gandhi remained unimpressed. I have grown disillusioned with the Western civilization. The people whom you meet on the way seem half crazy. They spend their days in luxury or in making a bare living and retire at night thoroughly exhausted. I cannot understand when they can devote themselves to prayer. Suppose Dr. Cook has, in fact, been to the North Pole. What then? People will not, on that account, get the slightest relief from their sufferings. While Western civilization is still young, we find things have come to such a pass that, unless its whole machinery is thrown overboard, people will destroy themselves like so many moths. Gandhi's negative assessment of Western civilization would never change, and though he continued to travel by train and ship, he would never fly and always abhorred the pollution and violence of urban industrial machinery. Smuts refused to yield to Gandhi's demands, and Crewe refused to do more to pressure his colonial colleague than to suggest that he considered the Indian arguments more sympathetically. To Gandhi's mind, therefore, this mission had yielded precious little at a very high price in sterling and time. On the eve of Gandhi's departure on November 12th, the Reverend F.B. Mayer hosted a farewell dinner at his Westminster Palace Hotel, to which, among others, Motilal Nehru came, having visited with his 20-year-old son Jawaharlal, who had just completed his studies at Harrow School and was now enrolled at Trinity College at Cambridge. Gandhi thanked the Reverend Mayor and all who came to cheer him along, informing them that as long as he was alive, he would continue the passive resistance struggle for equality and partnership in the empire. The meeting then expressed earnest sympathy with the Transvaal British Indians in their peaceful and selfless struggle for civic rights. The deputation left for South Africa on November 13th and reached Johannesburg on December 2nd, 1909. Those weeks at sea proved to be one of Gandhi's most fruitful fortnights, for he wrote his first major book, Hind Swaraj, Indian Home Rule. Written in Gujarati, the book was published that year in two issues of Indian Opinion and was translated into English for publication as a book early in 1910. As with many Gujarati works and ancient Indian philosophic expositions, Gandhi wrote his first opus as a dialogue between himself, the editor, and a constantly questioning reader. He modestly disclaims any originality for his brilliant work, attributing its inspiration to Tolstoy, whose life and book, The Kingdom of God is Within You, profoundly impressed him, and to Ruskin, Thoreau, and Emerson. However, his critique of Western civilization and the British rule in India was original enough to lead to the book's immediate seizure by British Indian authorities. Gandhi later noted, "To me, the seizure constitutes further condemnation of the civilization represented by British government. The British government in India constitutes a struggle between the modern civilization, which is the kingdom of Satan, and the ancient civilization, which is the kingdom of God. The one is the god of war, the other is the god of love." The reader of the Hind Swaraj dialogue asks why, If civilization is such a disease, the English afflicted with it have been able to conquer India. To which Gandhi's wise editor answers, the English have not taken India, we have given it to them. Who was tempted at the sight of their silver? Who bought their goods? In order to become rich, we welcomed the company's officers with open arms. The sword is entirely useless for holding India. We alone keep them. We keep the English in India for our base self interest. We like their commerce. They please us by their subtle methods. We further strengthen their hold by quarreling amongst ourselves. One question the reader asked, however, was not easily answered by the otherwise self assured editor. How can they be one nation? Hindus and Mohammedans are old enemies. Our very proverbs prove it. Mohammedans turn to the west for worship, whilst Hindus turn to the east. Hindus worship the cow, the Mohammedans kill her. How can India be one nation? India cannot cease to be one nation because people belonging to different religions live in it. Gandhi's optimistic editor replied, if the Hindus believe that India should be peopled by only Hindus, they are living in a dreamland. He insisted that the enmity between the Hindus and Mohammedans had ceased long before the British arrived. The British, he argued, stimulated communal conflicts to help them divide and rule over all people of India. Those were, however, hardly adequate answers to questions that would echo much louder each subsequent decade, eventually rising in crescendos of hate inspired pain that reverberated 40 years later in the prelude to and aftermath of partition. Gandhi finished his book before he stepped ashore in Johannesburg and 3 days later addressed a meeting of 1,500 Indians in the Great Mosque. Their life and death struggle, he argued, was on behalf of the whole of India, indeed, on behalf of the whole empire. The mass meeting resolved to carry on the struggle by means of self suffering in the shape of imprisonment and otherwise. The next day, Gandhi cabled Gokhale, who had sent him a gift of 25,000 rupees from India's richest Parsi industrialist, G. Jamseti Tata, thanking him and reporting that he expected imprisonment before the month's end. Much to his own surprise, however, he was not arrested on December 22nd when he entered Transvaal from Natal with Manilal and several others. Clearly, having learned while in London how many friends Gandhi had in the highest as well as the lowest of places, and how potent an appeal his passive prison martyrdom made upon the conscience of the world, Smuts ignored Gandhi's return. Having steeled himself in preparation for returning to the prison palace with his son Manilal, Gandhi was disappointed. Instead, he found himself welcomed and his newspaper bolstered by adulation and financial support. For the first time since starting Indian Opinion, he was free of debt. And for the first time since its founding, his Phoenix ashram was functioning without major personnel or financial problem. Despite his resolve repeatedly to defy the Transvaal Act, he was, moreover, still a totally free man, allowed to come and go across the borders of Natal and the Transvaal with impunity. The angst or envy of success, the discontent induced by newfound safety, plagued and disturbed him. How could such affluence and security of modern life be right after all? In March 1910, Gandhi led a respectable number of passive resistors into the Transvaal. The government again disappointed them, however, refusing to arrest anyone. This non arrest means a great deal of waste of money and energy to the Indian community. Indian Opinion reported the Transvaal government intend to exhaust our resources. We must be prepared to meet them undaunted.